are in a sermon series through the small Old Testament book of Habakkuk, and called Hope in the Waiting. Hope in the Waiting. So we're going to be looking at Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 2 through 20. So it's going to be basically the whole chapter 2 of Habakkuk we're going to be looking at today. If you remember back in 2021, as we came out of COVID, we did the story, right? And one of the people responsible for the story is a pastor by the name of Randy Phrase. And Randy Phrase told this story to his congregation about when his mother was dying. So when his mother was dying, Randy went to her bedside and prayed. And he prayed, he said 50 times. He counted because he believes in prayer and that God wants us to be persistent in our prayers. And as he was praying and as he prayed, he was very bold. And this is what he asked God to do. He asked God to give his mom 18 more years. Now, 18 wasn't just an arbitrary number. 18 was, he picked that number for two reasons. One, she was 62, and he thought 18 years she'd be able to live to 80, a nice round number. But the other reason was because he had a niece who was just born. And he wanted his mom to see her graduate from high school. And so he prayed that God would give her 18 more years. And he did this because, and he was that specific because he remembered the Old Testament story, 2 Kings chapter 20, where King Hezekiah, who was this wonderful, good king, became ill. And the prophet Isaiah went to Hezekiah and said, "You're going to die. You're not going to recover from this illness." And Hezekiah pleaded with God and pleaded with God. Isaiah laughed, and as he was leaving the courtyard, God said, "No, turn around and go back and tell Hezekiah you have 15 more years." And so based on that, based on his faith, Randy prayed and prayed that his mom would have 18 more years, but she didn't. They didn't even have 18 more days with her. Or months with her. They didn't even have 18 more days with her. Within 18 hours, she had died. And that left Randy with a bunch of questions, right? He asked himself, what is this all about? Does God not love me? Have I not served him like Hezekiah did? Did he not see my tears when I turned my face to the wall and wept bitterly? Why did God come through Hezekiah and not for me? We have all had those moments like Randy, where we pray and we seek God's help and we seek answers, and God seems to be unresponsive and silent. But in those moments, what are we to do? And I think that is one of the lessons that we can learn here from Habakkuk. The way that we are to respond when God doesn't respond in the way that we want him to. So let's just remember where we are, what the context of this whole book is about. So Habakkuk is a prophet. He's one of the righteous people in Judah. And Judah is experiencing this transition where they had the good king Josiah, who put in a lot of reforms. And as a result, Judah experienced God's blessing. But Josiah was killed in battle, and his son Jehoiakim came to be king. And Jehoiakim was not a good king. He undid much of his father's reforms, and corruption and violence and injustice comes back into Judah. And Habakkuk, on and Habakkuk as a representative of all the righteous in Judah cries out to God, God, where are you? Why haven't you come to help us? Aren't you going to do anything about this violence? Aren't you going to do anything about this injustice? And the response that God gives to Habakkuk, remember, is this: well, I am at work, and I am going to deal with it because I'm sending the Babylonians, this savage, violent people, to deal with it. Wait, and this is where we were last week. This answer that God gives to Habakkuk is not the answer that he wants, right? He begins to question God. God, I thought you were the Holy One, right? I thought you were the one that rescues us. Are you going to turn your blind eye to this violent people? Are you going to let them destroy us, your covenant people? Are you now showing favor to these wicked people instead of us? And so last week we saw Habakkuk just give all this to God. He questions God. He laments to God, God, where are you? Why are you doing this? And then the end, what we saw was Habakkuk make this commitment to stand silently and wait for God. I'm going to trust you, God, and I'm going to wait for your response. And that's where we are this morning. What does God... So that brings us to this our text this morning, God's reply to Habakkuk's question. So let's take a look here at this text. And it's longer than what we normally look at, but... So let's take a look here at Habakkuk chapter 2, starting with verse 2. Then the Lord said to me, write my answer plainly on tablets so that a runner can carry the correct message to others. This vision is for a future time. It describes the end, and it will be fulfilled. If it seems slow in coming, wait patiently, for it will surely take place. It will not be delayed. Look at the proud. They trust themselves, and their lives are crooked. But the righteous will live by their faithfulness to God. Wealth is treacherous, and the arrogant are never at rest. They open their mouths as wide as the grave, and like death, they are never satisfied. In their greed, they have gathered up many nations and swallowed many peoples. But soon their captives will taunt them. They will mock them, saying, what sorrow awaits you thieves? Now you will get what you deserve. You've become rich by extortion, but how much longer can this go on? Suddenly your debtors will take action. They will turn on you and take all you have, while you stand trembling and helpless because you have plundered many nations. Now all the survivors will plunder you. You committed murder throughout the countryside and filled the towns with violence. What sorrow awaits you who build big houses with money gained dishonestly. You believe your wealth will buy security, putting your family's nest beyond the reach of danger. But the murders you committed, you have shamed your name and have forfeited your lives. The very stones and the walls cry out against you, and the beams and the ceilings echo the complaint. What sorrow awaits you who build cities with money gained through murder and corruption. Has the Lord of heaven's armies promised that the wealth of nations will turn to ashes? They worked so hard, but all in vain, for the waters fill the sea, and the earth will be filled with an awareness of the glory of the Lord. What sorrow awaits you who make your neighbors drunk. You force your cup on them so you can gloat over their shameful nakedness, but soon it will be your turn to be disgraced. Come, drink and be exposed. Drink from the cup of the Lord's judgment, and all your glory will be turned to shame. You cut down forests of Lebanon. Now you will be cut down. You destroyed the wild animals, so now their terror will be yours. You committed murder throughout the countryside and filled towns with violence. What good is an idol carved by man, or a cast image that deceives you? How foolish to trust in your own creation, a God that can't even talk. What sorrow awaits you who say to wooden idols, "Wake up and save us." To speechless stone images you say, "Rise up and teach us." Can an idol tell you what to do? They may be overlaid with gold and silver, but they are lifeless inside. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. What does God expect of his people when life doesn't make sense? When life gets turned upside down, there's one very important thing we're called to do when life doesn't make sense. And we see it here in this text. And what we see here right away in Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 2 through 5, is that God gives Habakkuk a message to share. Right? Write my answer plainly on tablets so a runner can carry the correct message to others. This vision is for a future time. It describes the end, and it will be fulfilled. If it seems slow in coming, wait patiently, for it will surely take place. It will not be delayed. Look at the proud, for they trust themselves, and their lives are crooked. Here it is. But the righteous will live by their faithfulness to God. Wealth is treacherous, and the arrogant never rest. They open their mouths as wide as the grave, and like death, they are never satisfied. In their greed, they gathered up many nations and swallowed many people. So God gives Habakkuk a message to share. It is to be written on tablets so it can be shared correctly with people. And this message is, first of all, is that God is going to bring his judgment on the evil people. Not only on Babylon, but also on those evil people in Judah. God is not going to stand for it. This is going to happen. God said, trust in me. Those who live by their own way, those who do what they think is best, that's going to lead to death. But the righteous will live how? Through their faithfulness to God. When life doesn't make sense, when life is turned upside down, when God seems to be silent, what are we to do? We are to live by our faithfulness in God. That is what the righteous people do. What does righteousness mean? Righteousness means to have a right relationship with God, with people, and with creation. To live properly with God, to live properly with people, to live properly in this world. That is what we are to do. And we are to do that by living faithful lives to God. And in the Old Testament, what faith is, it is trust, it is loyalty, it is commitment. That's what it is. To be faithful to God, to have faithfulness, is to be loyal to God. It is to be committed to God. It is to trust God, to trust in his character, to trust in his promises, to trust in his law, to trust in his covenant. We are to trust him, and we are committed to him no matter what. And so for us to be righteous, for us to have right relationships with other people, to right relationship with creation and right relationship with God, we need to live by faith, to be faithful to God. Because if we don't, God says, you're going to end up in the grave. You're going to end up dead. But for us to live by faith, God needs to give us hope. And that's what the rest of the the chapter is about. God gives Habakkuk hope. Notice here that God does not explain himself. God does not tell Habakkuk, well, the reason I'm sending the Babylonians is because of this. This is my grand agenda. This is what my plan is. No. What God does is he simply says, justice is coming. I will judge the injustice. I will judge the evildoers. Trust in me. And so, in order to give them some hope, this is interesting, is that God gives Habakkuk a taunt. That's what he says. The ones who are, right, the ones who are being oppressed, they're going to raise up and taunt you. They're going to do some trash talking to you. Or not to you, but to the evil ones, to those who are oppressed. And what are they going to taunt them with? God gives them 5 woes, or as the New Living Translation, sorrow awaits. Sorrow awaits those who are thieves and who extort. Sorrow awaits for you. Sorrow awaits those who awaits those who are rich and profit through dishonesty and murder and violence. Sorrow awaits those who take advantage, sorrow awaits those who build big cities through corruption. Sorrow awaits those who take advantage of others and misuse God's creation. And sorrow awaits those who worship idols. These sorrows apply not only to the Babylonians, but all those who are unrighteous, all those who are violent and corrupt. When God seems to be inactive, we are to trust in his promises. God says, this is what I have promised to do. You can count on it. It will happen. It may not happen on our timetable. It may not happen the way that we want, but God is the one who will bring justice. God is the one who will bring judgment on those who need judgment. And we can count on that. Habakkuk and the righteous of Judah are to take hope in God's promise to deal with the violent and corrupt people who bring injustice into this world. So, that brings us to the big question, right? What does this 2,600-year-old prophecy have to do with us today? What does this mean for us? Well, God's instructions to Habakkuk is how we are to live. It is the very purpose of our lives. It's why we're here. It's the amazing purpose that God has for our lives. Right? So we'll often tell people, especially in an evangelistic setting, of God has an amazing purpose for your life. He has an amazing plan for your life. You want to know what that plan is? What is the amazing purpose that God has for you? To be faithful. To be faithful. Whatever your context, whatever your situation, whatever your circumstances, you are to be faithful. Whether that leads to prosperity and good times, or whether that leads to persecution and death, whatever it means, whatever that looks like for you, wherever you are on that, you are to be faithful. That is God's purpose, his plan for your life. And we see this in Hebrews chapter 10, starting with verse 32. Think back on those early days when you first learned about Christ. Remember how you remained faithful even when it meant terrible suffering. Sometimes you were exposed to public ridicule and you were beaten. And sometimes you helped others who were suffering the same things. You suffered along with those who were thrown into jail, and when all you owned was taken from you, you accepted it with joy. You knew there were better things waiting for you that will last forever. So do not throw away this confident trust in the Lord. Remember the great reward it brings you. Patient endurance is what you need now so that you will continue to do God's will. Then you will receive all that he has promised. For in just a little while, the coming one will come and not delay. Hear this. And my righteous ones will live by faith. But I will take no pleasure in anyone who turns away. But we are not like those who turn away from God to their own destruction. We are the faithful ones whose souls will be saved. Faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about things that we cannot see. Through their faith, the people in the days of old earned a good reputation. The book of Hebrews was written to persecuted Jewish Christians, possibly in the city of Rome, we're not really for sure, and possibly during the persecution of Nero, which happened between 64 and 68 AD. But whatever was happening, these Jewish Christians were tempted to give up on following Jesus and to return to their roots. They were tired of being persecuted. They've already experienced this one wave of persecution where they had all their stuff taken away from them, where some of them were thrown into prison. And now they're experiencing this second wave of persecution that was threatening their very lives. And they're like, hey, I think we've had enough of this. I think we'll go back to being Jews because that's a legal religion within Rome. You know, like, we can escape all of this. And so when you're looking at and reading through the book of Hebrews, that's the reason why the writer of Hebrews spends so much time at the first part of the book explaining why Jesus is superior to the ways of the old covenant. Why do you want to return to the old ways when the way of Jesus is superior? That's his argument. That's what he wants them to remember. And so here, as he tries to encourage them, don't give up yet, he quotes Habakkuk. And he quotes from what's called the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Old Testament. That's why it's not quite the same. But he says, the righteous will live by faith. The righteous will live by faith. Those who have a right relationship with God, those who have a right relationship with people, those who have a right relationship with all of creation, they will live by faith. And a commitment, trust, loyalty, and as I've been saying, allegiance to God because of Jesus. That's how the righteous will live. But God's righteous ones will live by faith. Faithfulness is the purpose of our lives. This is why we were created, right? This is why we were created, to be faithful to God. What was the great sin when Adam and Eve took from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil? What is the sin? It is this unloyalty. It's an untrust of who God is. They did not remain faithful to God. Our great purpose in life is to remain faithful to God, regardless of what happens. And that's the entire context as you go through Hebrews chapter 11. You know, it starts off with this definition of faith. And however you want to define faith based on Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, Faith is the confidence that we have, that what we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about things we cannot see. It has to make sense within the context of what comes before it, talking about people and encouraging people who are going through persecution, right? And what comes after it. And notice here what the writer of Hebrews does not say about these people who are going through suffering, who are going through poverty, who are going through all of those things. He does not say to them, "You of little faith." He does not chastise them for their lack of faith. In fact, he does the opposite. He reminds them of how great their faith is. So when the writer of Hebrews says, faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen, what faith is the living out of what we believe God has said to us. It is the belief that God's kingdom is coming into this world, and so we're going to be part of that. And that's the reason why the early church did what they did. That they helped those who were in need. They fed the hungry. They clothed the naked. They visited those who were in prison. Why? Because that ushers in God's kingdom. That is the world that they knew God had promised. And so that's what they're going to do. And as we do that, we experience God. And we see what God wants. And so as we look through Hebrews chapter 11, this great chapter on what it means to live by faith and all the examples of faith there, we see about all these, we read about all these people from the Old Testament who trusted in God and they experienced, right? They experienced miracles. And they experienced rescuing. They experienced all of God's blessings. And then you get to the end of the chapter. And it says, by faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions, quenched the flames of fire, escaped the death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. Women received their loved ones back again from the dead. And we love that. Love that victory there. But he goes on to say, but others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life when? After the resurrection. The faith that we have right now is not a faith that is to make our lives all better and achieve all of our dreams right now. That's not what it is. The story of Hebrews, what the writer of Hebrews wants us to understand is that we hold on, we are faithful to God because we believe in better things to come. That when Jesus returns, he's going to make everything right. And the people who were tortured, who were thrown into prison, who were torn in two, and all of that, the writer of Hebrews said they had a good reputation for their faith. And the people who experienced miracles and the people who were killed for their faith are all in that great cloud of witnesses that we read in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. Those people who stand as a testimony that God keeps his promises, that God is faithful, and that it is possible because of God's character, because of who God is, for us to live faithful lives as well. So when life doesn't make sense, when it seems like God is slow in keeping his promises, when we wonder, God, where in the world are you? Our eyes are to go to what? To the resurrection and new creation and the promise that Jesus will return one day and make everything right. He will bring the justice. He will bring the judgment. He will give us the blessings of life that he has promised to us. Habakkuk had questions for God. What was God doing? Did he not love Israel anymore? Was he turning a blind eye to the evil of the Babylonians? And God responds, not with answers, not trying to explain himself, but with the reminder that a person in a right relationship with God, with people, with creation, lives a faithful life, a life loyal to God, trusting in his commands and his promises. The writer of Hebrews used that same thought to encourage Jewish Christians not to give up. God's people live by faith in all the different circumstances and situations of life, waiting on that day when Jesus returns and makes everything right. The better life that is after the resurrection. That is where our hope is. That is where we stand firm on. So the purpose of our lives is to what? To live by faith. That's our big idea this morning. The purpose of our lives is to live by faith. We are to trust God and his commands and his promises to bring justice and restoration to his good creation. The way we live, then, it will be evidence that the gospel message we teach is true. The way we live our faithful lives is evidence that what we say, what we proclaim is true. And here's our challenge this week, to pray this prayer. Pray this prayer. God, no matter what happens, I will trust you. Strengthen me in those areas I lack trust. God, no matter what happens, I will trust you. Strengthen in me in those areas where I lack trust. That prayer conveys our intention, our desire to trust God, to be faithful. It also acknowledges our weakness, that there are times when we don't feel very trusting in God. So God, strengthen those areas where I lack trust. The purpose of our lives is to represent God in this world, right? That's what we've talked about. We are created in God's image, and that means we are to represent God in this world. And that means that we bear his image. And the only way we can do that is through faith. That is why faith in God becomes our purpose. The only way to represent God is to have faith. Our trust, our loyalty in him. The righteous will live by faith. That is what we have been called to do. The righteous will live by faith.